Hey guys, Matt, IronTrap Garage, and today with our Hot Rodding 101 series, we're going to go over why your Stromberg carburetors are leaking. Not if they're leaking, why they are leaking, because pretty much all old Strombergs, they leak. And a lot of the things that we've come across recently as we've been going through our big batch of old carburetors to start putting them together for some of our cars, we've come across a lot of common things that almost every one of these carbs have. Most of these top 5 things probably isn't an issue with it. And if you have a car that's leaking or running poorly and has a set of Strombergs, this is a video you probably want to watch. So let's get started. All right, so the carburetors that we're covering, Stromberg made a lot of different carburetors over the years, but the carburetors that we're covering are the most common carburetors that are used in pretty much all of old hot rods and customs that are of the style that we build. And it's a carburetor that's going to look a lot like this. So this style Stromberg came in a number of different sizes and names. There's Stromberg 97s, which is probably the most iconic. There's 81s. There is a number of different ones that you can get, but they all basically have the same flaws or issues that can happen to them over the years. And if your carburetor looks like this is what we're going to be covering. So if you have a Ford carburetor that may look similar to this, it is a Holley carburetor, and the quickest way you can tell, notice that the fuel inlet on this Stromberg big logo 97 is right here in the side. A Ford carburetor, it's actually going to come out of the top. It's like cast into the top of the carburetor. So if your carb has the inlet that's cast out of the top, that's a Ford carburetor. It's a Holley carburetor. It is a little bit different than what we're talking about today, but if you have one that it comes in the side like this, has a 3-bolt pattern on it, then this is the one that you're going to want to be looking at. So let's jump into probably our number one issue that we come across with these carburetors and why they leak. All right, so the number one thing that we come across with these carburetors that leak is a sticking needle and seat. So with your needle and seat, we'll drop in some close-ups here, but basically we have a little needle valve here that goes inside, and the float, when it hits against it, actually pushes up against a seat and will close up and stop the fuel from rushing in. Oftentimes what happens over time is that these get a lot of crap around the edges of them from modern fuels or just deposits. If you have an old carburetor, it just has old gas that's built up around it. It is much like something that you want like on the valve seat on an engine. It needs to seal perfectly or you're going to have some sort of leak around it. So a lot of times these old metal ones, a lot of people prefer the original metal ones because you can clean them and kind of like lap them in so that they will seal. There's some different ways you can just tap them in there to get them to see. But if you're having a carburetor where it's just like overflowing, or maybe it was working fine and then all of a sudden it started overflowing, a lot of times it's this little needle valve that's actually sticking in there. And you will see that a lot of these old Stromberg carburetors, the tops of them will a lot of times be dented or banged up or scratched. That is because the official Stromberg tool number 2, other than the jet wrench, is a plastic screw, or should be a plastic end screwdriver that you bang on the carburetor to make the valve unstick. So a lot of times these will be dented and messed up because over the years guys would have carburetor problems. They keep a screwdriver or a little hammer, they tap on it, and that would make it fine. So when you're getting kits for your Stromberg carburetors, a lot of times you can get obviously the brand new kits that are right from Stromberg that are probably the best quality kits that you can get. But if you're thrifty just like us, you may get at a swap meet or on eBay or different places, you can get old unused kits that are brand new, like old stock. We get a lot of these when we do buyouts or buy estates out of old parts. A lot of times there'll be stacks of these kits. We like to use them. There's really nothing wrong with them, but you have to be careful with the needle and seat because a lot of these kits come with that, and some of them for a period of time they would come with a rubber tipped needle valve in there, and these, if it's an older one, they're not compatible with today's fuels. And what will happen is you'll put this in, it may seal for the first few minutes or first few miles or first few months, and then what it'll do is it'll break the rubber down, they'll start leaking, your car will start overflowing, and you'll start having issues. So if you do buy an old kit, that's something to look out for. If you pull it out and it has needle valve like this and has a little rubber tip on it, you may want to avoid it because a lot of times they end up causing problems. We tried using some of these that literally put them in and almost immediately they started leaking. After just having fuel pressure on them, they started leaking almost immediately. So we generally try not to use these. Now there are modern ones that are out there that some of the distributors sell now that have a a plastic type material that's on the end there that is fuel safe for today's fuels. If you see those kits, though, obviously we'll say that in the description, but try and avoid it. These, if at all costs when you get them, you can a lot of times use an original valve. I would trust that more than using these newer rubber tipped ones when you're using that. All right, your next thing that could be causing your leaking or flooding issues or leaking down issues with your carburetor could be a stuck or dead float. There are a lot of things surrounding the float which should obviously move inside of here. If yours does not move, it could be sticking, which could also be the needle and seat. But this is your little float here. It's usually they pretty much all carburetors, they look very similar like this. Now there are some replacements in modern day that you can actually get like plastic floats for these Strombergs. But these ones here, what can happen, you can actually see that they are made out of multiple pieces and they're soldered together. So these floats can go bad and get holes or leaks in them and they will sink. So you can actually check these and see if they will actually float to see if yours is good. If you take a float out of a carburetor and you shake it around and you hear like rust or dirt or you hear fuel sloshing around in it, it's probably junk and it's sinking when it goes in there. And obviously if this sinks, it's going to leave that needle valve open, which is going to just continuously flow fuel in there and overflow the carburetor and just cause a huge mess. Now with these carburetors, you do have to set, as with all carburetors, set the float level on these. A lot of the aftermarket kits or the better kits, they come with a little gauge, which is really nice, that you could set on your carburetor and actually put it across and set your float height with it. So you actually put it on the bench here like this. You can pour fuel in there, let the float come up, obviously make sure that it's not sinking, and then you can go in here and adjust it, and you can just bend the little tang a little bit to set the height of the float, and that'll get it sitting exactly where you want it. So if you have some of these old kits and you have one of these, definitely keep them around. They're good to have. Now Stromberg does suggest, I think in their manual for setting them when you set it upside down like this, there's either way is fine as long as you're getting it right. We've just found that it works a little better that way. I've had some that were done upside down and they still needed to be adjusted. So check these floats like I mentioned, make sure they're not damaged as well when you're looking at them. Not only can they come, the solder joint can come apart and have issues, they also can just get damaged from people taking them apart and rebuilding them. If they were grabbing them with pliers or something and crushing them, they can get holes in them. Or we've even seen where if a carburetor got some water inside of it and it froze, it may froze and damage this as well, and they're broken or cracked. And again, they can get brittle. These are old parts, so they can get brittle over time, much like a copper or brass radiator. You know, you see that they can get brittle over time and they'll start to crack and get hairline cracks in it. Same thing can happen with your foot, so check those. Now, the other thing that can happen is, again, user error with these. So you can see this carburetor here has a little tang on the top here that's kind of like a splash tang, if you want to call it that. This one here does not, and this one is the shape of it, it's bent really crudely. So over time when these getting adjusted, sometimes they get like just kind of willy-nilly. People bend these things and they can get damaged and break, or they can get bent out of shape so much that it just won't push on the needle valve right. And even though you seem to have it adjusted right, it's not hitting quite right on the valve and it'll still let fuel to leak by. So make sure you're checking that. If you have any question at all with this float, that there's anything wrong with it, swap it out for another one, because this can be probably one of the most common things is float height with an error when setting it up, or just a damaged float that's causing a problem, whether it's stuck or it's sunk or it's bent out of shape and it's just not working correctly. This is probably one of the most common things that people have after they rebuild a carburetor or they get a car that's having problems with it overflowing or flooding. And if your float height is too high as well, even though the carburetor may be working correctly, I had a problem on the Pagoda City Coupe even when I first got it running. We had the float height set just a little bit too high, and when I was driving the car, just from it riding rough and everything, it was actually kind of bouncing and splashing over because it was set so high. Not only was it running rich because it was kind of overflowing, but when you were bouncing around or you get on the car, the fuel would slosh and make it even worse. So by setting the float level down a little bit, it really made a huge difference in it, and that was the one where we set them upside down actually. But so that is the floats. Make sure you're checking them. You can get them again brand new, so if you have any question, it's not a bad idea to buy brand new ones or salvage them from your Stromberg carburetor junkyard like we have. All right, so next thing we're going to talk about is probably the most annoying thing with Strombergs, and it's just something that you almost have to live with, but there is some tips we can give you that maybe can make yours a little bit better, and that is external leaks. So if you have a carburetor that is leaking fuel out of almost every orifice, don't feel bad. That's pretty much how a lot of Strombergs are, but there is some things that we've come across that you can do, or issues that you may come across that will help you solve those problems with leaking. So probably the most common one you see, just when looking at a car that's Stromberg equipped at a show, especially if it's old Strombergs, is it is leaking right where these two pieces, so where the main body and your top meet, there is a gasket that goes here, and a lot of times you will see right around there, it is all like stained with fuel or dirty where it's seeped and the dirt's gotten on it. So a lot of times it will leak through there. So there's a few things that can cause that. So number one, obviously if your gasket, if you have a gasket that is poor, that's on there or ripped or something like that, it can cause that to happen. Now, if you have a carburetor that the float level or your fuel pressure is too high where it's overflowing the carburetor, even those gaskets that are on there, the paper gaskets, it isn't that good of a seal that it can hold pressure. So if there's fuel pressure pushing up through, it is going to seep out through there. So that is a common thing. So don't be alarmed if you have a carburetor trying to sit up and maybe your fuel pressure was too high, or you had your float level wrong and it was kind of splashing and dumping out of there, or if you had your needle valve stick and it was overflowing, that will happen. But if you have a carburetor that everything else is okay on it, but you just cannot get it to stop leaking around here, one thing to check is actually to make sure that these surfaces are flat and true. So over time, when these carburetors get tightened down, or if they've been adjusted, or if they just simply leak, a lot of times people will just take the flathead screws and just crank them down even tighter. And over time, if these screws are adjusted uneven, they can actually warp the top, and it will start to bow, and it'll never seal when you get to that point. So you can take it on a piece of sandpaper on a good, true, flat surface, and you can sand it and just use like Dicam, or if you just hit it a couple swipes with the sandpaper, you will quickly see where, like on this one here, you can see we were sanding, and there's a couple spots where the sandpaper wasn't actually hitting, where it's a little off there. Now this carburetor has a good example of another reason it may leak. If you have an old carburetor where it's pitted around here and you just put a paper gasket right over top of it, especially like right here where it's very pitted, that's going to leak because fuel is going to seep right past that. So that is one spot that they commonly leak that you need to look out for. So finding new tops, if you have one that's warped, if it's warped too far, you probably can't sand it all the way down, and that can cause an issue. Now the other thing with the tops, before we go to the next thing, is these screw holes here. They are just little tiny screws, and it is very common when people start really cranking on them to try and tighten them down to stop the leaking, that they will strip those threads out, and it'll just pull the threads right out. So if you have an old carburetor, you get a car that already is set up with Strombergs and are leaking, and you go to tighten them down and they just spin, it's not uncommon to see that these threads get pulled out of these bodies. You can get like a helicoil kit, drill it out, put a helicoil back in it, and it'll be just fine. Just obviously be mindful when you're tightening these down. They don't need to be like as tight as you're putting the lug nuts on your car. They just need to be nice and snug, and if you jump around and tighten them evenly, you shouldn't have really any major problems. So the inlet on these Stromberg carburetors looks like this. There is a little like crush gasket that is like a fiber crush gasket that goes on there when you tighten these down, and you basically thread this in like this, and you tighten this down, and you crush the little fiber gasket. So what can happen over time is that if the carburetors were rebuilt, or if somebody was having problems where they're taking this out to mess with a sticky needle valve in there, they may over tighten this and it will actually strip, just like that. See? Stripped. Not good. So if you tighten these down in here and they are stripped, you can see this one is a good example. The threads are pulled out of it. So what happens is somebody over tightens these, or just from using it over and over and over again, they will pull the threads right out of there, and it won't get a good tight seal. So when you tighten these down, it is a crush, like fiber crush washer. You want to tighten it down so you feel, that you have some tension on there, but again, don't go tighten it down like you're trying to torque the heads on a flathead. You want to just snug it down, and the best The best bet is to snug these down, and after you fire it up and run it, if it's seeping a little bit, just go just a tiny bit further and you will eventually get it to stop leaking. But try and use new fiber gaskets every time you take these apart if possible, or definitely when you're rebuilding, put a new fiber gasket on there. Now the other thing that can happen with causing these to strip or have issues with them leaking around the inlet valve is when you go to tighten these down, you're obviously going to have a fitting that's going to go into here. A lot of times, and I've done it myself when I first started messing with these, you forget to double wrench it. So you forget to hold this one, and as you're cranking down your fitting in here, it will turn this and actually start cranking this tight, and it'll pull the threads out of the body. Again, major issues. So again, you can get threaded inserts where you can drill these out, put a new threaded insert in there. It's not an easy thing to do. You can send it away to some of the Stromberg specialists and get that redone as well. But if you have one where it's stripped out, it's good to either just get another body or, you know, obviously have to repair it there. But make sure when you're tightening this down, you don't over tighten these or you will have issues. All right, and the last spot to leak on a Stromberg on the exterior of the carburetor, and is probably the most annoying and hardest to stop the leak, is the jet weld plug that actually threads into the bottom here. And you have the 3 that are in the bottom here for the power valve and your jets that they will thread in there. There is, again, a fiber type gasket that goes under the head of that bolt. The new kits, actually the gasket that comes with them is a little bit smaller in overall diameter. It doesn't touch the whole entire surface of that weld plug. And that, I think, is the major issue when people rebuild these. This gasket isn't as good as the old ones that were a larger diameter. So it doesn't have as big of a surface area to actually seal against. And a lot of times these will seep, trip, leak. If you ever look at a car that's Stromberg equipped and it has right underneath of it, there is a wet spot or it's all dirty right underneath the carburetor, it's because this is seeping or leaking. This is extremely hard to get to stop. So sometimes we've had luck with getting the old style seals and reusing them, and it does work, but it still can be hit or miss with this. So the thing that you need to do, and this ties in with a lot of the leaking, I actually found mention of this on the Ford Barn or the Ham or one of the sites where there was discussion of obviously having problems with leaky Strombergs. I was looking it up. So there was a gasket dressing or a sealant that I think is from the aircraft industry that was used that basically the name escapes me of what it was called, but Permatex basically started offering it. So it's the PermaShield gasket dressing and sealant. It's fuel resistant, is a blue color, and it basically is like the bee's knees for sealing up old Stromberg carburetors. So is this deep blue color, almost like Ford blue. And basically you put just a tiny bit of this on your gasket surfaces, and it is resistant to fuel. It never fully dries, so it stays like a little bit tacky, but this will stop leaking or majority of your leaks by using this. So you can use it on pretty much everything I've covered. So for instance, if you have a body like this where it is a little bit pitted here, you can use a little bit of this sealant and it will kind of take up a little bit of that. It's not going to, you know, solve the world's problems here if you have a car that's really pitted, but you can get away with some impurity or imperfections in the surface there. The other thing you could do is with the weld plugs that we were talking about, you could put a little bit of this on both sides of the gasket, a little fiber gasket before you put it on, and when you tighten it down, it will kind of seep in around and it will help seal that surface with those smaller O-rings or smaller gaskets. It will help with sealing with that. This has pretty much been like a savior for us because before that they were always just dripping and leaking, and even on the bench we couldn't even get them to stop leaking. And now we've got it to the point where they're pretty good. You may still get a little bit of seepage on these old half worn out Strombergs, but we were able to get these to seal pretty good. You can pretty much use it on any gasket surface that we talked about where it may be leaking. So on the carb top to the body, you can use it there. You can even put a little bit on that crush washer that you use for the inlet valve, just a tiny bit on there if you're having some problems. But when you're using all new gaskets, it won't take very much of this, but the biggest use of this, where it's the biggest help, is those weld plugs that we talked about. Those are the hardest thing to get to seal without seeping, and if you use this will definitely save your butt. All right, so the number 4 thing, and it's probably the most hidden of all the issues that can happen with a Stromberg that causes it to leak down, or if your carburetor is leaking while it's idling or just sitting here on the bench and it's just shooting out of the carburetor while it's just sitting on the bench. The thing that can cause that, and is the thing we've come across, I would say 9 out of the 10 times, a old Stromberg carburetor is going to have emulsion tubes that have been crushed. This is something that actually we just figured out recently, and it was a little scary to take them out. They are kind of pressed into the carburetors, but it's fairly simple to pull them out. There's companies like Vintage Speed that offer a tool to actually tap and pull them out, or you can make a homemade tool basically with just a bolt and some washers and stuff like we've done. And but basically what happens with these is they have these little, these are the emulsion tubes here, and they have these little holes here that if you tighten down your jet too tight onto these, so your jet actually butts up against these and keeps these tight and seals them up so that they don't leak fuel. And if you crank down on them too tight with your jet wrench, or if you have one of the jet socket wrenches, you can go too tight with them and it actually compresses them. It will crush them down and it'll make these holes oblonged. So we have a couple of them here that actually they are crushed down, and the opening here where the holes are supposed to be is much different, and that is a quick way to tell. So if the holes are oblong or if it's crushed down or uneven, that'll be a quick way to tell that those emulsion tubes have been crushed. That's going to cause an issue where it's going to cause it to actually leak down when it's just sitting there, and it'll start shooting out, or when you're idling. So that is a problem that can happen. So the emulsion tubes, there's a lot of things that can happen around them, but that is probably the most common hidden thing. So in order to get to these, to check them out, what you definitely should do anytime you're rebuilding carburetors is pull them out just to make sure that they are good or bad. You can buy them brand new, or if you have a Stromberg junkyard like we have, you can go through carburetors and you might get one good one here, one good one there. Now, there is a small difference to happen in these over time where they change the number of holes that are in these from 4 holes to 2 holes. And from what we understand, basically the 2 holes is just that it's stronger. The 4 holes, because there's holes drilled in it, obviously it's a little weaker, it was easier to crush. So make sure that you're matching them. So if you get them and you have one 2-holer, one 4-holer, try and get a pair of them together. It doesn't really matter. I don't know if they're any better or worse other than, over tightening them, but either way you can crush them. We've pulled out both styles and they've been crushed. So with these, when you put these in, another thing we've run across is these bodies can wear out over time. So the jet, basically these go in like that, and then you have your jet, and a little jet wrench here that goes in, and this threads in and basically pushes against that emulsion tube. And as you tighten this down, if you go and really crank on that, that's when you can actually crush that emulsion tube, and it can cause that issue. The other thing that will happen is these emulsion tubes should basically be a very snug fit, not necessarily like a press fit like you would think you would need a press, but they are kind of hard to press in. You can take your little tool if it's already tapped and you can push it right in there like that. Now, one thing we've come across recently with a set of carburetors we just rebuilt was that we could not get them to seal because of the emulsion tubes, and it was actually that the body was worn out. So we have that one here, and it just literally just dropped in. There was you didn't have to press it at all, it just dropped in, and it was actually it's loose in there. And that's what the problem was. It's just worn out. That opening was so oblonged or oversized at this point that it was allowing the fuel to get past there and cause an issue. So check all of those things. We're rebuilding it. I know it's a huge bummer if you got like a big logo 97 and that is oblonged and you're not getting it to seal. It's really hard to fix that. There might be a way to do it, but not something that's easily done. So that can be a huge bummer. But if it's not going to seal, if you have new emulsion tubes, you've made sure the jets are tight and everything's good and it's still leaking past there, check your emulsion tube to make sure it doesn't just simply fall in, because that could be your problem. You may have to just change the whole entire body out. All right, so our number 5 thing that's most common that we see that causes leaking internally on a carburetor is when you have a damaged power valve. So the power valve, if damaged, can just leak right by it and just dump raw fuel into your engine and can make your engine, if it's loading up or just constantly running rich, you can't figure out why, there's a good chance that you may have a damaged power valve. So these power valves have a spring, they should have some spring tension to them with the valve when you touch it like that. And when they go bad, you will lose its spring tension like this one here, and the valve, it's basically just floating around in there. So obviously that's going to allow fuel to leak by because it's loose. So the damage you'll see on this for a bad power valve is usually something you could see when you take it apart. So if you see a carburetor when you go to take it apart and it is all hogged up where somebody's been in there slipping with screwdrivers and all kinds of different stuff, you may want to check these power valves to make sure that they haven't been damaged. The other thing that will happen is actually the valve itself will get bent or scarred or damaged from someone when they're trying to actually take the power valves out. They will stick a screwdriver in there and they won't kind of get the valve pushed down quite right before they start turning it, and it will basically bend it or break it or gouge it, and it'll start leaking by there because it has been damaged. So check these out if you can. Definitely take a look at them, make sure that they are good and there's no major visible damage to them before putting them back in. As with anything when you're rebuilding a carburetor, especially Stromberg carburetors, is if you see something or you have a hint of an idea that it may be damaged, it's probably best not to use the part because it'll probably come back and bite you later on. You'll have to take the carburetor all apart. So these power valves, definitely check them out. Again, you can buy all these parts brand new. So if you are in doubt, go ahead and get another power valve for your set of carburetors and you will be good to go. All right, so that was our top 5 reasons that we've come across on why your Stromberg carburetors might be leaking. Now, as with all of these Hot Rodding 101 videos, I'm not trying to say that what we're giving you is the only instances or cases or ways you need to do something, but it's hopefully a jump off point for you that will help you if you have trying to choose what tires you're doing or want to learn about an engine, or in this case, learn about leaky Stromberg carburetors. We're trying to give you the most common things that will get you going and will be definitely save you some time versus learning it the hard way like a lot of us have done it, where you have to just take apart 100 carburetors and they leak and take them apart again and go back and forth. So these are the instances that we've come across that are most common. You will never know what you're going to find when you start taking old Strombergs apart because they are so old and people have had so many problems with them over the years and don't know what they're doing. They will damage them and do different things. So definitely are going to have to buy multiple carburetors to make usually one good one. So if you want to run 3.2s, 4.2s, 6.2s, expect to have to get, like if you want to run 6.2s, 12 carburetors potentially to make 6 good ones, because you may run into this where you're going to have to scavenge parts, or a body's broken or a top is warped. So don't be surprised to do that. There's a reason that the brand new, really nice English-made Stromberg carburetors are like $500–600 a carburetor, because it can get costly to build the vintage ones as well, because when you open up that $100 or $200 core and you find out that half the parts are broken, you're going to end up being at the $500 or $600 anyways. So if you don't want to mess with these, definitely look into the brand new Stromberg carburetors. They are great. I run a set of them on the Pagoda City Coupe, and it was pretty much, other than just some foot adjustment, little adjustment to idle air screws, we were pretty much set and driving the thing, and I've really set them and forget them and just drive the car, and it's awesome. So the other thing is that I wanted to mention that we didn't really get into is leaky carburetors. Another thing that causes it is just basically a dirty carburetor. If there are air passages that are clogged with dirt or rust or anything like that, it can cause it to do weird things where it's going to leak or run like crap or not idle. And the best thing you need to do is really take the carburetors all the way apart, blow them out with shop air, and clean them the best you can. If you can afford it, definitely look into some sort of ultrasonic cleaner. It has been like a lifesaver. We can throw these parts in there, and not only does it clean it so that they visually look good, it also gets in all those little passages and cleans them out, and it saves you a lot of time and second guessing yourself if you got it cleaned out with brake clean or shop air. And after like a couple cases of brake clean, you're nearing the cost of a small ultrasonic cleaner, especially if you can find it secondhand. We use the Eastwood one that is large enough to put, bigger carburetors in there, but you can find a little bit cheaper, smaller ones. They obviously also offer smaller versions, but definitely think about getting an ultrasonic cleaner because it is just really, really nice. So thank you guys for watching. If you have some tips for Stromberg carburetors, because we are definitely newbies to this compared to a lot of people that watch our channel that have been doing this for way longer than we have. If you have some tips or things you've come across, definitely down in the comments. We want to hear from you guys. Give us some stuff that you've come across or little tips for any of us young guys that are trying to learn about taking apart Stromberg carburetors and making them work and not leak. Thank you guys for following along. Appreciate it. Catch you later.